India, on the other hand, has managed so far to navigate this very complex region with a certain degree of carefulness, because our equities lie in all three states, all three stakeholders, whether it is Israel, whether it is Iran, and whether it is the Arab states in the Gulf. But our equities are also with the US. So in a sense, India has been navigating this very complex quagmire for a very long time.
Namaste. Welcome to The Long View. Subhash Chandra Bose Chair on International Relations at Chanakya University initiates this podcast with Professor Harsh Pant, who is here with us to discuss on a very important and current issue that we are dabbling with in international relations, the West Asian crisis. Professor Harsh Pant, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Chetan.
So, under the chair on Subhash Chandra Bose Chair on International Relations, we are very keen to understand our extended neighborhood, and we consider West Asia as an extended neighborhood, who is currently very critical for us and our Indian regime and the policy. What do you think of this current issue or crisis that is unfolding in West Asia? Is it a episodic escalation, or is it something deep-rooted in the larger geopolitics?
In West Asia, things never seem to stop. There's one crisis often leads to another, and then another, and there is it seems as if we have never had any proper resolution to any of the fundamental structural problems that you're talking about, and that is the reason why. In some ways, this particular crisis should also be seen as one node in a seemingly never-ending chain of events.
Yep.
There is so much history in the region. There is so much identity politics. There's so much politics and geopolitics that it is the jar is brimming to the surface, and often it overflows, and therefore we end up into one crisis after another, and therefore, I think we should also, some people may assume that because Mr. Trump has said that 5-day reprieve, and I will not, we would be looking at some negotiations. I think it would not be considered as something that will put a lid on the problem. It may or may not resolve this particular crisis, but I think there are many more crises to come, because the fundamental challenges of the region are not getting resolved in any fundamental way. So, in that sense, I think one should look at it not as not as an episode, which will end with a resolution, but as another episode in a larger chain of events, which, unless the structural realities are confronted and acknowledged and managed, we will not find peace and stability. And for India, therefore, it becomes very critical, because as you mentioned, this is part of our extended neighborhood, and increasingly, as India has grown, and as India rises, as India's capabilities grow, as India's aspirations and appetite grows, our reliance on the Middle East, on West Asia, has continued to grow.
Yes.
And therefore, we can see how challenging it has become to manage the energy crisis that is emanating out of this problem. How difficult it has become to think about our large diaspora in the region and their security, because everything is interconnected. The security of sea lanes of communication, freedom of navigation, all those issues that were critical. We find that India is confronting them, or is having to confront them, because of this crisis that US has unleashed on Iran.
I would definitely want to come back to you on the energy crisis and the diaspora's current challenges that we are now witnessing, and of course reading it in everyday newspaper. And I'll come back to that. I would be very interested to know further on this, the very fact that you mentioned that it is more of a structured issues associated with stability and instability on one hand, and not merely an episode. It's a continuum on one hand. On the other, how do we look at this extended neighborhood for India and its priorities, especially now that India is leading the BRICS? And how does India as a nation at this point would like to reconcile and strategize its position in terms of navigating between deep engagement to ensuring strategic autonomy? As a domain expert in this whole peripheral issues and also the core of this issue, how would you inform us on this thinking.
So there are multiple fault lines in the region, and we have Israel and Palestinian issue. We have Israel and Iran issue. We have the Arab states and Iran. We have US and Iran. And so in some ways, the region is structured around what most stakeholders in the region would consider Iran to be a problem from outside.
Sure.
India, on the other hand, has managed so far to navigate this very complex region with a certain degree of carefulness, because our equities lie in all three stakeholders, whether it is Israel, whether it is Iran, and whether it is the Arab states in the Gulf. But our equities are also with the US. So in a sense, India has been navigating this very complex quagmire for a very long time. So if you see India's recent history, for example, one of the things that comes out very interestingly is that India has managed this complexity very well. That we have been able to expand our ties with the Arab states. Our ties with the Arab states, particularly in the last decade, has reached an extremely high point. UAE and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, where our energy, trade, investment, people-to-people ties have gone through the roof. On the other hand, our ties with Israel, technology, trade, and again, people-to-people engagement has been growing expansively, and Prime Minister was there just before this crisis as well. We have had Iran in the middle somewhere, where our traditional historical ties with Iran, India has been able to manage them, protect them, and preserve them in some way, despite Iran being seen as a problem in large parts of the world, and despite Iran being seeing itself or positioning itself as a country that is more of a disruptor in some ways, with the nuclear question, with the question of using its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis. Despite that, India has maintained its channels of communication with Iran, as is evident in this crisis as well, but also investment like Chabahar project in Iran. So in a sense, India has balanced its ties with all three, and that balancing itself gives India a strategic autonomy on core issues. So the fact that India is still is the only country in the world that can talk to US and Iran at the same time, I think in some ways signifies the heft that it carries in a very volatile part of the world, where certain kind of binaries are very, very critical. And I think that is in some ways very, very important from India's perspective, to continue to preserve these relationships, multiple relationships, and multiple stakeholder engagement at the same time. So, and I think that is why it is so critical that we look at the region as a whole and India's position in that as a whole, rather than looking at it in blocks.
Because in that sense, are we considering this as more of, for India's point of view, is it an opportunity or a missed opportunity in the current scope of operations that we are seeing from the country? So on one hand, we have, as you said, this kind of quagmire which creates this need for engaging with all. On the other hand, we also have to ensure our strategic autonomy. And the other angle, we are looking at how India can use this as an opportunity to position itself. So in this, I was very keen to know from your point of view that how BRICS would play a role. Will it have any role to play in this ongoing conflict, or would it be, again, distancing itself to the extent that it has a limited scope to engage with?
I think BRICS certainly will be an interesting platform to watch out for, because for two reasons. One, from India's perspective, India has BRICS presidency this year, so India will be hosting BRICS summit later this year. The other is that BRICS has expanded 2 years back. So and with that expansion, it brought in countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE within BRICS. So BRICS is no longer the 5 original members, it's BRICS plus. And which means that the contestation between these actors will also play itself out within BRICS. So the ability of BRICS to manage this contestation will be an important part of the diplomatic exercise that India and also others will have to do, will have to manage. And this includes China, because China is equally dependent on the energy flows from the region. So I think much like what happened in the G20, where India was navigating this very complex tightrope walking between the West and Russia, I think we are going to see some of that diplomatic juggling here as well. But I don't see a united BRICS approach to this, because there are just too many actors here which have very divergent interests as far as this region is concerned, particularly the Iranians and the Arab states, which of the Gulf, which will have very different views on what has gone wrong and how it can be made right.
Yeah, I think this is very informative and also timely, because now there's a lot of discussion in the last few days at least about BRICS and BRICS Plus and its role. So I'm sure that will be a great value add for our viewers and listeners. Specifically, I was also wanting to get your perspective on the point that you mentioned earlier about the energy and maritime security. How does this conflict affect positively or negatively India's energy and maritime security issues, especially that we have been reading. Now it has become a household conversation. The LPG has become a household conversation. Then there is a lot of interest now to understand from the meta to the micro. How does this operate? How this conflict is influencing or affecting India's maritime and energy security policies and approaches?
I think first at the global level, right? We have been talking about energy independence for so long, but when we look at the result of this conflict, we realize how dependent the world remains on one particular geographical choke point, and that is the Strait of Hormuz. And the fact that the world is so concerned, and the fact that it has been unable to do anything about it, is certainly should alert every country about the need for diversification and about the need to be less dependent on one geographical area, in this case again the Strait of Hormuz.
So sorry to cut you here. So does it mean this classic economic interdependency that we refer to in international relations is something that we may now have to revisit?
I think so. I think we are revisiting it in perhaps every space, right? We are saying that, look, we can't be over-dependent on China on economic matters. So therefore, offshoring, friendshoring, China plus one strategy came out and is now the driving standard operating procedure for most countries.
Yes.
Most countries want to have diversified set of partners, economic partners, when it comes to trade, when it comes to investment. Similarly, in our case, we also looked at the Russia-Ukraine war and we said we are too dependent on Russia.
Yes.
And we need to diversify defense partnerships. And I think this is about energy now. That I think a thing that I think often got lost when people used to talk very optimistically about economic interdependence. That interdependence also creates vulnerabilities, and I think that was a point that often traditional realists would have made.
Yes.
But in the aftermath of post-Cold War bonhomie, it got lost in translation.
Yes.
That economic interdependence also has its costs, whereas all we were doing were counting the benefits. And I think the costs are now becoming very visible. And in this particular case, certainly the energy independence, which has been a mantra for many countries. But if you look at it operationally, we are still so dependent on certain countries, on certain geographies, that we are struggling to cope. I think India has, if you see the trajectory of India's energy policy, we have diversified. Somewhere close to 30 now. We are around, I think, 40 to 50 sources of energy that are part of our energy mix. There is also this balance between renewable and non-renewables that we are doing. But I think still the fossil fuel dependence from the Middle East remains at an all-time high. And how do we navigate that, particularly in light of this weaponization of that dependence?
Yes.
We have talked about this or seen this in the context of China, weaponizing economic interdependence. But here, weaponizing the energy dependence and the way Iran has played its cards. Now, you can understand it from an Iranian perspective. The Iranian regime has nothing to lose.
Correct.
I mean,
That's true.
So if they are dying, the motto would be that we'll take you along with us, right? So they are throwing all that they have at it, and their leverage is Strait of Hormuz and disruption of the Strait of Hormuz. So they can externalize the cost of the conflict, so that the global economy feels the pain. And those actors then put pressure on America and Israel to bring the conflict down and de-escalate the conflict. Something of that seems to have happened in the last few days, where Mr. Trump has given a pause to American attacks on Iran. But the larger issue that one country can single-handedly disrupt global supply chain like this is something that India has openly talked about. and India has expressed its concern and annoyance at it and anger at it, that this should not be allowed to happen. But again, the issue is that there are not many countries are there today which can possibly prevent that from happening. So while Mr. Trump called upon a lot of its allies to do the bidding, but they, of course, they were not consulted in the war. They said this is not our war, so they have not entered into the war. But the larger question remains as to how do you resolve this conundrum, and unless that is resolved, the costs on the global economy will continue to rise. Energy prices are rising. We know that. Economies are faltering because inflation is rising. Inflationary pressures are there on the economy. So eventually, I think the global economic pressure will be unsustainable. And Prime Minister in Parliament has said that, look, this is a challenge for the long haul, that we may have enough resources at home to manage it for the foreseeable future. But even if war stops today, bringing back the energy supplies to what it was before the war will take time, because the assets have been destroyed, the pipelines have been destroyed. So that will take time, right, to rebuild that. So in that context, we are looking at an energy landscape which will take time to resolve itself, which means that the costs will have to be borne by ordinary people, and then we will bear those costs, whether it is in the way of inflation, or whether deficiency of certain products and resources, or whether it is larger geopolitical dynamic where countries will compete and contest more for every single resource that is available out there.
That's very insightful, because on one hand, we are talking about how to overcome interdependency, especially on issues of this kind. On the other hand, we are also looking at escalating globalization of trade. So this is a very interesting conundrum to even address, because this is how the curriculums are shaped in terms of this spectrum, two ends of the spectrum. But on the other hand, this is how the world is getting shaped through these conflicts, to revisit whether what we engage in teaching international relations to what we practice international relations, to how do we reconcile this. Having said that, energy remains the core of this conflict because of the notion of weaponization that is. So I'm sure your thoughts will also open up to reflect upon, either now or in future, the emphasis on critical raw materials. So one important takeaway I see, in addition to the dependency and interdependency issue, is also how to now predict the dependency on critical raw materials, whether we should go for alternative, or should we sort of create those pathways and forums to facilitate of such kind of potential threats of weaponization of critical raw materials, which is very easy to do actually because of the over dependency that we have on that. So thank you for that insight. Now, to conclude, I'm keen to know your views on what kind of a neighbor should India aspire to be: a balancer, a builder, or a bystander in the context of this conflict?
See, bystander we cannot be, because it is impacting not only our larger interests but day-to-day lives, as we have been discussing in India. So bystanding or being a bystander is no longer an option for India, I think, in particular, given the stakes that it has increased in the region, and given the way this conflict has played out. Balancer we have been. We have tried to balance multiple stakeholders in the region, and I think that has paid off dividends. But whether this will continue to pay us the dividends that it has paid still remains to be seen, because it will depend. It is now contingent on what kind of a regional architecture this conflict leaves behind. So I think essentially I would say that we have to start thinking about being a builder, in the sense of building partnerships, building regional architecture, whether it is security or economic. Often in India, we are very cagey about saying that, look, we want to shape regional architectures.
True.
It has started changing in recent years. We are now part of two regional Middle East related platforms like I2U2 and IMEC. I2U2 is India, Israel, UAE and US quadrilateral, which is there in the Middle East, and IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. And this is a way to shape and to build regional architecture, economic and strategic. And I think there is no alternative for India but to move more assertively in that direction, because if we are not going to do that, then we will continue to see these kind of larger impacts on our foreign policy through indirect means. We are, in this case, the conflict has been externalized on us. We are not a party to the conflict, but we are, we are one of the most serious bearers of the consequences. And if we don't do it, then others would do it, which is, in this case, Chinese would be learning similar lessons. So what role will they play in the future if such a scenario continues? So I think my focus would be on building partnerships and building regional architectures in whatever domains we find comfortable, at least in the short to medium term, because this is going to be relatively more tricky or trickier than we have anticipated. And the conclusion of this crisis is no guarantee that there won't be another crisis very soon.
That's very insightful. And I just want to ask you one last maybe a statement from you with regard to, because once when we see such conflicts emerging, we have analysts, activists, and advocates who are proactively engaging across the globe. What would be your message to young researchers in this domain who are understanding the neighborhood and the extended neighborhood with regard to this conflict? What would be your message in terms of how they should be, exploring this conflict per se to study the neighborhood, in terms of your experiential insight that you have been engaging on such issues in the last few decades and continue to engage?
I know for young researchers, I would say be true to your profession, which is do research and research based on serious sources. Don't go to YouTube for your information, and avoid thinking of the region or the conflict through. Avoid looking at it through the lens of slogans, because it often gives you very shallow answers. We can say down with Israel or down with Iran. That is not really the issue here. The issue here is something more fundamental. And unless we understand the drivers of the conflict, our ability to shape the outcome of the conflict would be very limited.
Because that's something which is very useful. The reason I asked that was that we often see that very early in their career or in their thought process, they get into this mode of activism or advocacy, but very limited analysis or analyst mode. I think that's one way of looking at how one can engage in analysis, leading to advocacy and activism. Of course, that's also very important as a learning curve, right? And also in terms of contribution. So thank you so much, Professor Pant, and we look forward to learning more from you on this conflict through your continuous writing that you do on very regular basis. Thank you once again, and
thank you for having me.
Thank you.